Hi, my name is Vivek Anand and I'm a research scientist in the Ashton Grayville Spatial Orientation Lab. And I gave this presentation just yesterday at the Aerospace Medical Association conference. And now I'm back home and I'm like, why not re-record it here and then put it up on my website. At the conference I got into like a flow state and I'm not going to be able to reproduce that magic today. But you know, what I will be able to do is move it a little bit slower because I won't have this time constraint on me. So the title of my talk is Artificial Intelligence as a Potential Countermeasure for Spatial Disorientation. And spatial disorientation is when a pilot or an astronaut loses sense of which way they're oriented, of where up is. And you could imagine that this would be very dangerous. In fact, it's one of the leading causes of fatal aircraft accidents. This is where people are dying. So this is a very serious deal. It's something that we really need to figure out. But how can we do that? So in the first part of this presentation, I'll be sharing how I try to study spatial disorientation by creating a disorienting spaceflight analog condition. Then I'll talk about how I collect data, how I take that data and feed it to a hungry AI model that then goes and tries to make predictions into the future when someone has lost control and crashed in my situation. And then I'll talk about the results and some ideas too. Now this isn't my spaceflight condition just yet. This is what I call my Earth analog upright condition. Here people have a pretty good sense of where they are in space. And I take living human beings and I strap them into this machine, and the machine is programmed to behave like an inverted pendulum. And all that means is if you do nothing, this machine just falls over to one side or the other. And what you're also going to notice is that there are crash boundaries. So if you go too far, about 60 degrees from that center point, the machine will stop you and will automatically reset you to that center point. And that stopping, that's what we call crashing, when you hit that boundary. Okay, so I also want to thank Heather and Sasha Panik, who did all the foundational research and the programming behind this machine. They were at that conference, so it was a special event. Now what I ask people to do is grasp that joystick and to the best of their ability, balance themselves right about that center balance point. And what you're going to notice here is that I'm blindfolded. So in terms of sensory information that I'm receiving to figure out where in space I am, well, I'm not getting that information through my visual system because I'm blindfolded. I'm also not getting that information through my auditory system because I'm wearing noise-canceling headsets. Most of the information that I receive about where I am in space is through my vestibular system and, to a secondary extent, the touch receptors on my skin, because as I, push against this machine, I'm getting information. Now, as a very quick refresher into the vestibular system, we are going to take a magic school bus ride. And as we go into the vestibular system, we will discover that it's made of two different things. The first are the semicircular canals, and these detect angular acceleration that you get from rotations. And then the second thing are your otolith organs, and these are fine little hairs that are adorned by crystals. And they detect linear acceleration, but really for this presentation, what they're informing us of is how much we're tilting away from gravitational vertical. And gravitational vertical is where that balance point is. So it's important. The further you get away from that balance point, the more gravity is kind of pulling on those crystals, deflecting the hairs. And so those hairs are deflecting more and more and more, and you can use that to figure out how far away you are from the balance point. And in other words, you can use gravitational cues, how gravity is pulling on those hairs and how much those hairs are deflecting to determine where you are in space. So in this condition, the upright Earth analog condition, people have a pretty good sense of where they are in space, even though they're blindfolded. And again, this is because the otoliths. It's because the more they tilt, the more those hairs deflect. They can use gravitational cues to determine their position. Now, my second condition I call the back condition, the space flight analog condition. And here I take people and I tilt them onto their back. Now all the dynamics are exactly the same. Same inverted pendulum dynamics. If you do nothing, the person is just going to fall to one side or another, and their job, just like the upright condition, is to stabilize themselves right at that center point. So how is this any different? Well, if you remember, in the upright condition, the further you got from the balance point, the more those hairs deflected due to gravitational cues. And so you could always use that, up, where up is, as a reference point. You always knew where up is, and so you knew how far away you're tilted. But on the back, those hairs, gravity is just pulling them down, saying, hey, you're on your back. And whether you're at the balance point or you're really far away, those hairs are no longer telling you how far away you are. They're just saying, hey, you're on your back. So you cannot use gravitational cues anymore to figure out how far away you are from the balance point. Now, and so this is why we call this a spaceflight analog condition, because also astronauts on certain parts of their journey will not have reliable gravitational cues to be able to figure out which way they're oriented. So, long story short, even if some of that was confusing, the main takeaway is that when people are on their back trying to balance, as a group, they show very little learning. There's very poor performance and very high rates of hitting that crash boundary. Okay, and 90% of participants report that I don't know where I am when they're doing this task. 100% of them show it in their data. And what I mean by this, 100% of them are showing in their data that they're disoriented. They don't know where they are in space. So that's why this condition is a good way to study disorientation, because pretty much everyone shows it in their data. Everyone is getting disoriented. And then a whole bunch of people show very bizarre, unusual, unexpected illusions. So, there's a bunch of people, like 10% of them, who, they're on their back doing this, but they're reporting that they feel like they're below. Some are saying that they feel like they're completely upside down. Very hard to believe, okay? I mean, I don't doubt it. I think that's what they're experiencing. But this is just highlighting how unusual disorientation can be and how varied it can be, because only about 10% are experiencing that. The rest are not. So for this experiment, what I did is I got 34 participants, and they came in 2 days in a row. And on each day, they were in the machine for 20 trials. Each of those trials were about 100 seconds long. And all they're trying to do is, and so that's about 40 minutes in the machine each day. And all they're trying to do is, to the best of their ability, balance themselves in the spaceflight condition where they're getting disoriented. Now, there are a few limitations here. So when I ran this study, COVID had just hit. So I was prohibited from running any experiments with humans for a year and a half. And I was like, oh no, what am I going to do? And luckily, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health came to my rescue. They gave me funding, and so I was able to use deep learning techniques on pre-existing data. And because of that, I couldn't run any more people. I had a limited data set, so I only have 34 people. And usually for deep learning AI studies, you want a lot of people, you want a lot of data. And then the other kind of limitation was that if I had the opportunity, I would have recorded a lot more stuff. I would have recorded EEG if I could have, or things on the body like heart rate variability, a lot of the different things that other researchers are exploring. Could have done that, and that could have easily been put into a deep learning model. So those would be things that I would do if I could do it again without COVID. So in any case, I still think there's a lot to learn from here. So we took all the data, and then before each of those crashes, we took out the continuous piece of data. So data where people are not crashing, we took those data out. That's what we call episodes. And we had 21,000 of those episodes across all of the data. And then what we did is we split all that data into two groups. 90% of it went into training the AI model, and then 10% went into testing the AI model. And we did this thing called tenfold cross-validation. And all that means is we do 10 different times, we split the data, and then we got 10 different performance metrics or whatever, how well the model is doing. And then we average across all 10 to get like one kind of total number of that. Okay, so for each of these episodes, then what we did is we took a sliding window, and that window is about a second long. Anything longer didn't seem to really improve performance. And that sliding window went and it extracted a bit of that raw data. And that raw data consisted of angular position, angular velocity, joystick deflection, and then this feature engineered metric called destabilizing joystick deflections, which my previous papers show was important. It improved performance in the model, so we kept it in there. Okay, so the sliding window goes, it takes that chunk of data, and in the training phase, it takes the AI model, it feeds it this data, and then it also provides the model with a 0 or a 1 for did a person crash in a certain time into the future, time in advance, or not. And I'll talk about like the different lengths of time into the future that we looked at. Okay, and then for the testing phase of the AI, from the testing pool, we took the data, we fed it to the AI model, and then asked it to predict in the future, hey, is there going to be a crash or not? So we tried all of these different types of models, and the one that fit our needs the best was stacked GRU. It's a recurrent neural network, and it's, people say it's good for like time series data, and it was the one that we chose. So then we tried to evaluate the model, and usually in the field what people use is this thing called the AUC curve, and we got some phenomenal results, 99%. I was ready to party. And then I began to think, and I'm like, well, what does this even mean? What is this thing called the AUC curve? And that's when Yonglin, who's the brilliant computer science grad student who did pretty much all the work, I provide the framework, but she's the one who figured everything out under the mentorship of Pengyu Hong, who's the computer science professor at Brandeis who specializes in this stuff. So in any case, Yonglin told me, look, AUC is the measure of how well the model balances false negatives with false positives across all these possible thresholds. And so then I was like, I start ruminating, I start thinking about it, and I was like, in my context, false negatives are way, way, way worse than false positives. I'm going to explain that to you. So false negatives, the AI model goes negative, you're not going to crash, but it turns out that's negative. That's false. You do crash. So that's the worst. That's absolutely what we're trying to avoid. We don't want the model to say you're not going to crash and then you crash. That's the worst. People die like that. On the other hand, a false positive is the model goes positive, you're going to crash. Turns out to be false, you don't crash. Not ideal, but certainly not the worst thing in the world. So part of what I wanted to do was minimize the false negatives. And so here's a summary graph, and each of those dots, it took like a day or two of simulation time. So this is a lot of hard work on just this one graph. On the x-axis is time in advance. So the further you go down, like to the right, the more into the future you're looking. On the y-axis is this thing called precision. And precision is inversely related to the false positive rate. So again, what we're trying to do is get a high precision. That means you won't have too many false positives. And then those different colored lines. So you start with the blue. So the different colored lines are recall, which are inversely related to the false negatives. And this is something we really want to minimize our false negatives. So we chose really high recall values. And the blue line, 85% recall is quite high already. It means very few false negatives. And then you get to the red line, which is 99%. That's almost no false negatives happening. So the first thing is, just so that we can kind of like digest one point on this graph, in the paper that's cited below, what we said is that we're confident that we can predict 800 milliseconds into the future and predict that whether someone's going to crash or not. And there we got 99% AUC, so doing really amazing. And then if we pick the green line, for example, where we set the recall to be at 95%, the false negative rate's quite low. But the trade-off again is that the false positive rate is going to be somewhat large, and so it's going to be about 60%. And I forget if I said this or not, but the other things to look at this graph is, as you go from blue to red, right, from as the recall gets larger and larger, the precision drops. So there's this trade-off. If you're trying to minimize the false negatives, the false positives increase. I forget if I said that or not, so I'm telling you now again. Okay, so this is kind of like the results that we got. Then we wanted to know, can we avoid, like how many crashes could we prevent if the AI was able to provide this warning potentially in real time? And if someone could instantaneously respond, so obviously this is not humanly possible, you'd have to have an AI co-pilot that would respond to this AI warning, then 80% of crashes could be avoided. But if you account for human reaction time, we chose 400 milliseconds, then that means that, only 30% of crashes could be avoided, but hey, that's better than nothing. Now we start wondering about the false positive rate, because we had a large amount of false positives. And so the question was, well, where do these false positives even happen? And so here's a graph. On the x-axis or angular positions, those gold or yellow bars are the false positives. You can see on the right, that's where most of those false positives are occurring, at 50 degrees and beyond. And if you remember, 60 degrees is where the person is losing control and crashing. So, this was reassuring. We were like, okay, this is good. What this means is that most of these false positives are happening in the danger zones, when people have huge angular positions and velocities, they're close to losing control anyways. If we had time, we would have made a third classification of warnings, and that would have reduced our false positive rate. But this brings us to two very fascinating and interesting questions. The first is on trust and AI. Right now, it's not well understood what rate of false positives would reduce trust that a human has in an AI. And this is certainly even more unknown for spatial disorientation, because spatial disorientation is unique. Like, you can't trust what's inside you. You can't trust your vestibular system. You can't trust your inner senses. So now you have to rely on what's outside of you. And, if there's ambiguity from what's outside of you, that might be catastrophic. You may not trust it at all. So these are things that we really need to study in greater detail. The second point, which I think is kind of even more interesting, is emerging from my research with vibrotactile feedback. And vibrotactile feedback isn't AI, but it's like an external agent. It's something outside of you. You could replace it with AI, or AI could control vibrotactile feedback. But in any case, what we're finding is that cognitive trust, and this is how most of the literature on trust in AI tries to assess trust. They ask surveys and they just see, okay, does a person trust AI or not? But what we're finding is that even if they say they trust it a lot, that doesn't really mean that they can rely on it. So, my participants are saying very high levels, 95%, yeah, I trust these vibrotactors when they're in the spaceflight condition. And yet, they're not able to rely on it. And they're not able to rely on it unless they get a specialized training program that we created. And that specialized training program, in my language, is developing a subcognitive trust. And in this presentation, and by the way, both of those things are in these two papers I've cited. That second paper there, I just published a few days ago. It's my proud baby, so go take a look at that. But if anyone's interested in what this subcognitive specialized training looks like, that's in those papers, or you could just ask me and I'll tell you. So the next thing I began to wonder about is false negatives. When are those happening? And I found, again in this graph, the blue is the false negatives, that they're primarily occurring near the 0 degree point. And that was a little bit surprising, because what that means is that within the next 800 milliseconds, someone crashed. But why would someone crash when they're at the balance point? That's like the safest place you could be. Like, this is the furthest away from the crash boundaries. Like, what's going on? And so when I looked at the data, what I found is that within those future 800 milliseconds, people took a joystick and they smashed it. They did a destabilizing joystick deflection. They threw themselves off completely. And then you might be like, well, why? Why would someone do that? And the answer likely is because they're disoriented. They don't think they're at the balance point, even though they are. They probably think they're near the crash boundary. Now, it's important for me to express this in data, because I don't want you to feel like, oh, this is just a guess that I'm making. So I actually have data, and it's data from another study that I did, cited below. So in this study, I took people and passively moved them in the spaceflight condition. They're still blindfolded and everything. So they don't have any control. And that blue line is the angular position over time. That's what they're experiencing. And they're given just one task. Press a button every time you feel like you've passed the 0 degree point. Here, that faint black line is the 0 degree point. And you can see pretty much every time that blue line crosses that faint black line, that 0 degree point, this person is pressing the button. And this is in the upright condition where they have full gravitational cues. They have a very good sense of where they are in space. So they're doing a great job. They know where they are. I put them in the space flight, the 0G condition, and oh my goodness. You look at that at 10 seconds, just 10 seconds, it doesn't take long. This person's 50 degrees away, but they press the trigger button, meaning that they actually feel like they're at the balance point. Now, if this is real life, they'd be close to death. to be close to dead because they're so far off from where they actually are. This is astonishing. But what was way more bananas, unbelievable, when I first saw it, was after 40 seconds. After 40 seconds, this person is no longer pressing the trigger button, but you can see that blue line is hitting that faint black line several times. That person is passing the 0 degree point several times. And then afterwards I asked, hey, what's going on? And this person says, oh, I felt like I was 180 degrees away. So it's just astonishing how wrong this person was about where they are. And it's very frightening that this could be things that pilots may be experiencing. Now, we take another, and so this was kind of a representative participant. Other people also displayed this, and now we take another participant who is somewhat representative. Other people showed this. In the upright, the person does great. You put them in the spaceflight condition, and oh my goodness, the behavior is completely opposite. Instead of stopping to trigger press, now they're trigger pressing all the time, this person. They could be 5 degrees away, 15 or 50, close to the crash boundary, and they're pressing the button, feeling like they're always at the balance point. Truly bizarre. But this highlights the huge level of individual differences. And so this brings me to a hypothetical but important point that, like, let's say we get to the point where artificial intelligence can recognize when someone's genuinely disoriented and provides a warning that, hey, you're disoriented. Well, that may not be enough, because imagine person 1 is 30 degrees away, but they feel like they're 5 degrees away, and then they receive a warning. That person is going to respond in a completely different way than person 2, who also is 30 degrees away, but they feel like they're 180 degrees away, right? So this is something to really think about, and brings me into my concluding opinions. The first opinion is that there are many challenges for artificial intelligence as a countermeasure for spatial disorientation. The first is that there's just very few studies. We need a lot more. And we don't understand trust very well, and it's going to be important to understand that. It's hard to get big data, like a lot of data, on people who are spatially disoriented. And there are huge, huge, huge individual differences. And because of the enormity of these individual differences, we actually need way more big data. Now, the optimistic view, in my opinion, is that AI probably will be able to detect when someone's genuinely disoriented. I mean, even with my own situation, this what I've presented here, we got some pretty decent results just looking at angular position, velocity, joystick deflection, and no biosensors, right? Now you imagine, and on the panel that I was on, a lot of people were talking about different biosensors, such as EEG or heart rate variability, things like that, and you could imagine now all of a sudden we do have that capability. However, in my opinion, like I said in the previous slide, general disorientation, recognizing it by an AI, may not be enough. Now, in my humble opinion, I don't think an AI model would be able to predict a person's perception of orientation, because there's so many layers of perception, processing, I should say, that's happening in the brain for a person to determine where they are in space. You've got vestibular thresholds, which are just like, these are things that are detecting just when you're starting to make movements. That's different across so many different people. And then you've got angular path integration ability, where you're taking information about how fast you're going to make sense of where you are in space. You've got internal models. These are prior things you've experienced in life that are setting up expectations and thoughts about where you are, that's influencing your perception of where you think you are. And when you're disoriented and your mind is like, oh, what's going on? It's trying to patch together in panic mode a new reality, and it may go back to some of these past experiences. Like, how would a model ever have access to any of that information? Then there are multisensory contributions that are happening. So in my case, I shared like 10% of people who are doing this motion actually feel like they're doing something like this. That's likely because they're getting some sort of tactile information when they're in the machine, like from the 5-point harness that's pulling down on their shoulders. Maybe some people, that makes them feel like they're upside down. Who knows, really, right? So these are all things that are influencing people. And then, of course, attention and fatigue and things like that will influence it. Now, someone in the audience gave a very good point, which is that, hold on, your statement's a little too strong here, which I agree with. That it was a good comment. Because there are types of disorientation that AI models probably will be able to detect well. So like, well-characterized disorienting things like leans. This, I think, an AI model is certainly a human model. People have built this. You can detect that. So that was a good correction from the audience. Okay, Okay, so then the question is, well, okay, if my opinion right now is that AI probably won't be able to get in all situations a person's perception of orientation, what can we do? What's the solution? And during the conference, I was wearing all this artwork to foreshadow. So I'll just quickly share that. This was one of the artworks that I was wearing, and this was in collaboration with Shanna, who did the beading here. And this is a microchip that I put epoxy on. It's a Magic Jack, so it has both internet, the digital world, and phone, which is analog, so kind of like the human world. So it's kind of bringing together digital and human together. And then the hand itself is human destiny, and this is a distant planet, since a lot of my research is on space exploration. So this causes the disorientation, and then you kind of have this teamwork of human with AI. So that's what this means. And then I was also, on the day of the event, wearing this shirt here, and I should have prepared this. I made these 2 patches on this shirt. I don't usually wear pretty boy shirts, and that's why I was like, okay, if I'm going to wear it, I better make a patch. And you can see these 2 patches here, and they're essentially embryonic creatures. This represents humanity. It's got like the cell-like, connections here, and then this is sort of like the vast unknown of destiny. And then the other kind of like creature is AI technology, and you can see it kind of has like a network-like vibe to it. Again, kind of exploring this idea of like this collaborative connection between these 2 domains or universes. Okay, so coming back, what was my solution? Okay, and my solution is a marriage of artificial intelligence with human augmentation. And so the solution that I propose is that once artificial intelligence is able to detect general disorientation, it does that, and then it activates something related to human augmentation, like vibrotactile feedback. So these are vibrations, for example, that you feel on your skin that give you a better sense of where you are. And so then a pilot can use that to understand very quickly how far off they think they are. And again, the 2 vibrotactile papers that I have published are back down there. So have a read that. I mean, both are open access. So, a great thanks. This was all funded by the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, a little bit of NASA HRP as I transitioned over. I did a little bit of work, remaining work there. This is published, what I presented today, and crash prediction using deep learning in a disorienting spaceflight analog balancing task. I'd like to thank Jim and Paul, the directors of the Gravial Lab, Pengyu, who is the computer science professor, and of course Yonglin, who did all of the hard work. And I do a lot of investigations. Since I have more time here than at the conference, I can elaborate a bit more. Recently we explored, like, what does it mean to bring AI into a sacred space? And kind of the idea of, like, what is human destiny in AI? There are all these different viewpoints. One idea is that we're birthing AI. It's like our little baby. And we need to nurture it. We need to create an environment where it can grow as we would for our child. And so for that, we need to have vision. We can't just let it grow without control, but rather figure out how to create this environment. But the second viewpoint is that AI, or rather technology, has been around since even before Homo sapiens, because chimpanzees and all sorts of like Homo habilis, they were all using tools, which is a form of technology. And so this entity or whatever is kind of like our symbiotic collaborator, and it's always been growing. But then why does it feel so external? From either viewpoint, why does AI feel so invasive and external? And it may be because like a lot of corporations and stuff are using it for us to become, more efficient in work, but not further our feeling of exploration and freedom. And so the idea is, how do we do that? How do we add this element of spirituality, of exploration, where it feels something more than what it is? And I've explored that with human augmentation. I'm doing an exploration with dance and human augmentation. Of course, I love it, collaborating and meeting new people. So anyone watching this, reach out and let's talk. And then I finished with questions.